this is our esteemed panel to talk about financing a paradigm shift. I'll introduce the rest of the panel in a few moments, but first I wanted to kind of set the context for our conversation. I think maybe some of you wonder how the topics for these conversations get set, and what really happens is they get assigned to you. So what you're then tasked with is figuring out how to relate what you want to say with what your topic is. So financing a paradigm shift. We all as a team kind of started out with a question of what paradigm and what shift, because in fact there are several that you could talk about. But what I want to do to really establish this topic is back all the way up to kind of 30,000 foot level to talk about kind of the big picture here about what's going on. And what is going on is there is an incredible shift going on as the funding and capital that's required to transfer the entire energy system from basically fossil fuel-based energy to what's going to follow it with the various forms, wind, solar, and others. That is the paradigm shift. That's what we're going to talk about. And so now kind of thinking about that a little more, this is really building on things you've already heard over the last few days, but to just kind of really crystallize it a bit. You can pick your numbers for how much capital is going to be involved in making this transition, but it's certainly at least tens of trillions of dollars. So, it's at least 10 trillion, it could be as high as 50 trillion, it could be, who knows, but it's one of the biggest numbers you've ever heard with a dollar sign in front of it. So there's really no precedent, in fact, on Earth for a capital need as big as this. Then you have to kind of superimpose over that the time frame that this needs to happen in, and again, you can kind of pick your numbers, but if we don't get a lot of this done in the next decade, we have some real problems, and we need to certainly get it done in the next 2 to 3 decades. So if you sort of put that dollar number together with that time frame, you see a scale of capital needs that is just really daunting and concerning in many ways. And then I'll just add another layer on top of it, which sort of adds to the flavor and maybe the concern, which is that the way that the energy system has been funded historically, or certainly for the last 50 years, is basically the main sources of capital come from fossil fuel-based companies, so oil companies, coal, natural gas. They fund basically where our energy has come from historically, and utilities are the other major player. So they're sourcers of capital and appliers of capital in the traditional scheme. That's certainly been the main event up till 5 to 10 years ago as things have started to shift. So now those players aren't likely to be the sources of capital for this huge need going forward. They're going to be the losers in this deal. We don't say that to them directly, but but that's basically what's going to happen. They're not going to be a great source for capital. So this capital has come from somewhere else. That's a big problem. But as I often do, and probably all you do too, generally big problems actually also represent big opportunities. So that's how I'd like to frame this. And in fact, that's I think the only way to look at it. Otherwise, it's depressing. So that's the way we're going to look at it. It is a great opportunity. So then with that, I want to kind of sketch a little more of a picture, which is, where does all this capital go, or where is it all needed? What are the kind of the typical places, or sort of the main places? And with that, there's certainly going to be quite a bit of technical innovation that goes on to solve these problems. A lot of it's already happening. But technical innovation, R&D, takes capital, it takes money. These technologies, before they're established technologies in the marketplace, initially you have to put capital into them to develop them. So that's a big place that capital needs to go, is just the actual development of these technologies in whatever location that's going to happen. So there's one big use. Oftentimes these technologies then spur the development or growth of a company, the starting and growing of a company. Most companies need substantial amounts of capital as they grow in the initial stages. Surely, later they become capital sources or generators of cash. But initially, they take a lot of money to start. So there's another big application for capital that needs to be met in order for this to all work. And then the last big piece, which is in many ways the biggest piece, is, I guess we'll just call it project finance, because typically the applications that these things lead to are big projects that are going to be built out. You know, think of a large solar farm, for instance. There's a lot of capital involved there. Ultimately, somebody's going to earn a return on that capital, but you need the capital to start with. So those are three, you know, big and sort of clear places that capital goes. And in the end, if you think of it, there's kind of a flow. You start the technology with a technology, then you end up with a company, and then later that company sells products that need project finance. And so there's a continuum. And if there's a block or a break in that flow anywhere, then you don't get from start to finish. You're stuck. So again, thinking in terms of opportunities, and I'll be interested in the panel's perspective on this. In fact, the places where there are sort of shortages of capital are, again, that's a problem, but on the other side, that's an opportunity. That may be a chance because capital is really needed there to earn better returns because that's where the need is. And so somebody's going to be willing to pay that. So sorry to take a very blunt business perspective on this, but if you want to assemble 10 to $50 trillion of capital, you can't do that based on hope and, you know, we just really need to do this. Like, it needs to make economic sense. So I think we need to be just sort of brutal about that, or we're not going to get the problem solved. So so that pretty much sets the context. What I would like to do now is step back. We're going to go through the panel and have each person kind of describe what they do and how that kind of relates to dealing with this issue and this opportunity. But I will do that first, since I'm already going, about the organization I work with, CC3IC, or you've already heard about it, Climate Change Investigation, Innovation, and Investment Company. As I also hinted or said, we focus on the beginning of that spectrum, the new technologies that can help solve these problems. In spite of the tremendous and clear progress and you know, potential for solar and wind, a lot of the work that I've done to kind of assess, again, that investigation part is the first part of our charter. You know, where's all this energy going to come from? Wind and solar are clearly going to be super important and super big, but there, in my opinion, and in a few people that I've worked with's opinion, there need to be, if possible, some other sources in addition. And so, as I've mentioned in the Bloom discussion, we kind of purposely don't focus on wind and solar. We look for novel new forms of energy. And just to give you some sense of what that means, this is now after a year and a half of looking for these things and in fact getting involved in several. The first area that I always have antenna up for, and in fact have found at least one interesting technology for, is in the production of hydrogen. Hydrogen is a fuel that has terrific potential because when you burn hydrogen or run it through a fuel cell, it converts when combined with oxygen, it creates water. So so sort of byproduct or emissions are water or water vapor. That's pretty cool because water's good, and as opposed to so many other fuels, there are issues with what's emitted. So the only problem with hydrogen, which is not just a little problem, it's a big problem, is you have to think about where the hydrogen comes from. And the hydrogen has to come from a place that's both economic and also doesn't emit a bunch of CO2. And right now, in fact, the main solution for where hydrogen comes from, mainly the main issue is that it emits a lot of CO2. Basically, you extract hydrogen, like 80% of the hydrogen created in the world today is extracted from methane, or basically natural gas. So anyway, without getting into too much detail, we focus on hydrogen. There are challenges. We're going after dealing with those challenges. Hydrogen sounds wonderful, but in fact it has issues. We're focusing on those issues. So that's hydrogen. We still think that there's a place for particular forms of nuclear energy, in particular fusion, and in particular certain types of fusion, small scale, not the big ITER reactor that's been worked on in Europe and has had billions of dollars plowed into, and which will never, frankly, produce a kilowatt of energy because it's just going to cost too much. The economics, I don't know if anybody else wants to argue that point, but the economics of it are just never going to make sense. But there are small forms of fusion that actually do have quite a bit of potential, and so we're focusing there. Last thing we do, and then I'll promise to move on to the panel, is we also are looking for other sources of energy that we'll just call them exotic forms. And the only comment I'll make here is that there are lots of people that have what they think are exotic forms of energy, and if you dig into them, they break one or the other of the laws of physics. And that is right exactly where we say, thank you, but we're not interested. So we're very hard-nosed about there needs to be firm, accepted science behind what we're going to talk about or what you're going to work on. But in fact, as long as you hold to those rules, there are some interesting things out there too that you would call exotic, and I just won't talk about them yet, so you won't think I'm crazy. But there are some interesting things out there. So that's what we do. Again, focused at the beginning of this spectrum or continuum of energy. And how we're supplying capital. I already mentioned Bloom is something that we have invested in because we think it can make a big difference. So with that, I do want to turn to the other panelists. I guess we'll start off with, well, first I'll just introduce everybody. Matt Cheney is with ClearPath Ventures as well as Catalyze, kind of wearing two hats, but so Matt will explain more of your background and all the things that you do. But Matt, in fact, works with Joel Surface with both. Joel works at Brightman Energy, but also has a role in Catalyze, and you guys can explain how that goes together. Sure thing. So that's you two, and then Konrad has already been up, and you all have a great sense of Konrad's background and what he does. So I don't need to reintroduce you. And then Katie Hoffman is. On the panel as well, and her organization is the Resilience Collaborative, and she will also share her perspectives on a bunch of things that she's done and how it kind of relates to the context that we're talking about. So we'll kind of go in that order: Matt, Joel, Konrad, Katie.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'd like to get a few slides up here just to kind of frame the global world of renewable energy, and I think what I'll do is. Just stand up here for a second if I can. Is that possible even?
Yeah, you can go to the mic over here if you want to.
Okay, I'll do that.
All right. Here, I got to party on.
Just to be clear, the world of renewable energy, we're talking about fleet here, and these are like latest numbers on the additions of energy producing technologies to our fleet in general. You can see that lately we've been doing a lot more renewable energy. Surprise, surprise. It's still a small percentage of the entire fleet itself, but it's obviously improving. When it comes to investment in renewable energy globally, it's a little bit of a disappointment. I mean, we've seen declining overall numbers of money going into renewable energy investment lately, really for the last 5 years. It's trending up these days, but still we haven't reached the peak of where it was in 2011. That may come as a surprise. Overall, in terms of countries around the world, China's leading in terms of renewable energy project investment and so forth, is leading the United States and Japan and United Kingdom, and then it pretty much drops off. So even in the developed countries of the world, it may seem like a lot, but it's not a lot. A lot more can happen. It just further explains what the overall potential is. When we talk about regions of the world, where is it accumulating? I mean, surely in the developed countries of the world will appreciate most of it. It's, as you can see, as you get to China, and then as you compare it to the non-OECD countries, really a lot of fossil money is going into fossil energy in the developing world. Regardless of the potential, regardless of what we have heard during the course of this conference is what's appropriate. Just an unbelievable opportunity, but still a lot of the investment capital is going to traditional technology. Why in the developing world is so much stuff getting done there? Clearly the leaders, as you saw, in terms of the developed world and in China, we have feed-in tariffs. Feed-in tariffs have really pretty much driven production throughout, Germany included. Konrad would agree, I'm sure. And then you have other various methods of incentivizing renewable energy project investment. So in terms of levelized support mechanisms, it boils down to some pretty basic incentives programs, and without them, we very well may not have seen the type of investment levels that we've appreciated. So that's it for the short presentation on where we're at. So what have I been doing about it? I have formed and invested in project development companies that raise large funds, hundreds of millions of dollars in the last 15 years to principally wind and solar. However, I've worked with all technologies. The latest companies that I've been involved with have been MMA Renewable Ventures, Photoatio, Clean Path, and now Catalyze. Catalyze, I think I'll leave that up to Joel to explain what the rationale is behind this latest effort. But the goal is massive investment in renewable energy on a global level, looking to really make a difference. So with that, I'll stop.
All right. Thanks, Matt. Where the cowbells? The cheering section over here.
Calls, nice.
Oh, nice. Thank you. So I'm going to pick up where Matt left off. I've actually gone through what I consider 3 waves of change or disruption in what we call the clean tech movement. And over the last 15 years, I started investing into the first wave of clean tech. In fact, I was investing into it before it was called clean tech. I called it boring tech at the time because it was industrial, environmental, and energy technologies, and none of them had any cachet versus .com or software or biotech or whatever else. But something happened in 2001. We had a couple of different things converge at the same time. In California, we had rolling blackouts due to the gaming of the market by Enron and others, which crashed the energy markets, and people realized how fragile our energy market was in California. Second, we had the entire .com collapse, where we had a bunch of people that were selling things like myuseSocks.com, and finally woke up and realized that they had a more social they could have a more social impact by developing new technologies. And a lot of the people that were closeted, energy developers or solar, entrepreneurs, whatever else, came out of the woodwork. The third thing was this thing called 9/11, and I happened to be in California, survived the .com crash, and I arrived in New York City the morning of September 11th. That was my wake-up call to say, all right, if there's not going to be a public policy shift, we need to have a private capital shift going into this wave of investment. And there's a whole bunch of things that happen as venture capitalists that we help mobilize to be able to start growing this entire clean tech movement. So over the subsequent 6, 7, 8 years, huge growth in capital investing into the early stage technology, something that had long ignored in the United States. We had developed a lot of solar technologies through NREL and other places, handed it off to Japan at the time, then to China, Germany, to be able to further develop those. But we realized we need to have a renaissance in that, and we began investing into that. But it really, we brought down the cost of those technologies. There are a lot of successes, a lot of failures during that period of time. But the most important thing about that disruptive period was we created a whole bunch of new tech companies. But what was not happening fast enough was we weren't turning that tech into tangible results by putting more iron in the ground to be able to make a big difference. So my second disruptive step in all of this was really, where Matt had been, for 17 years, which is how do we bridge the divide between innovation and deployment, and how do we accelerate that, and then how do we scale that? How do we create massive scale in renewables? So I took on an effort in Texas, which became Brightman Energy, where we were trying to put wind and solar together and blending it through market mechanisms to really blend down the cost of renewables so you can take a 25-year PPA, power purchase agreement, and replace a coal-fired power plant with that. And so we went down that path, and over the last 3.5 or 4 years, we've acquired and have developed 1,100 megawatts or 1.1 gigawatts of renewable energy in Texas, building toward that thesis of how do we blend these things. But the third phase that we're going through right now is how do we thoughtfully or intelligently construct project assets so they match up precisely with what the market need is in such a way that you can shrink the timing of development of those assets, And how do you apply intelligence in the acquisition, development, and deployment and building of those assets so that you decrease risk, so you decrease costs, so you shrink the development cycle, so that you can blend wind and solar with other market trading mechanisms to be able to deliver more holistic solutions that are completely matched to what the off-takers, utilities, commercial entities, industrials, and even community solar and community gardens want. And how do you do that so that you can visualize that and do it quicker, cheaper, as the cost curve is coming down for all of renewables? So that's where Catalyze comes in. It's about putting together that first wave of innovation through software and applying it to that second wave of innovation, which is massively scaling renewable deployment, but being able to do that in an intelligent way that allows you or us to be ahead of the curve, lowering cost, and making sure that we have the tools and learn from those tools to value projects and value energy ahead of where the market is so that we can be more successful and more effective at deploying renewables worldwide. Did I do okay, Matt?
Yes.
All right.
There's the cowbell.
All right,
There's
thanks.
the cowbell.
All right, Konrad.
Okay, I don't know how much I can add to what you just heard a minute ago. I'll take a little bit time on my background. So I just joined the utility and energy world 2 years ago when joining E.ON. Before that, I was in new material sciences and polymers at BASF Venture Capital. Worked there for 6 years, and before that in corporate audit and strategic marketing. So more on the chemistry side, and those investments were a lot earlier. So I kind of can relate to what you said in the beginning. You know, you're putting very early bets in, and then you have to go through 5 or 6 different steps until you finally get to a result where you see it's working or it's not working. And in chemistry in particular, it takes a lot of cash also and time. In energy, in direct comparison, I see that things are thankfully working a lot faster than in chemistry, also because you're working with end consumers. And one example for that is E.ON has founded a company called E.ON Connecting Energy that is focusing primarily on C&I customers, so commercial and industrial customers, so companies like Costco's and Aldi's and like supermarket chains and warehouses. And we're trying to provide them tools and services on the question of how they can save energy, how they can be more on renewable energies. And one example for that would be an investment that we made in a company called First Fuel, based in Boston in the US. And they're doing remote energy audits. So instead of having boots on the ground for every single energy audit, for every single house or warehouse, they're basically using a big data approach to bring down the cost and bring some results to those customers and help them with really actionable items, how they can save energy. And I think that is one of the points that what it boils down to. It needs to be something that everyone can understand, that actionable items come out, that the residential end consumer and the commercial end consumer says, if I do this, this is my benefit. And we need to get it more easily across that what is it that needs to be done for the end consumer to get to a point where he wants to. And one of those decisions that also ended up in the question like who's going to pay for that was back in 2011 when Fukushima happened. And before that, everyone was like, nuclear power plant is the only thing that we can do if we want cheap energy. And after that milestone, so to speak, people were like, okay, I get it. It's not going to be cheap. I will pay for it, but I want it. So at the end of the day, I don't think, no matter how we slice and dice it, the end consumer is going to be the one having to, actually want this. And here in the US with the tax equity scheme, to my understanding, it's a tax break. So again, it's going to be something that the government will be giving out. And at the end of the day, this is money that is not going to be used for other spending. So at the end of all that is going to be the end consumer, the voter again. And I think the question is more about how can we get the idea across, and not so much the question, who's going to be ending up with the, to open the bag.